Hello, everybody. Sincere apologies for the delay and for the IT glitch, but hopefully now we have it running. So as I had mentioned, I will present a short presentation on parent self-care and well-being, and then Dr. Kadri and myself will have a short Q&A discussion, chit-chat, and we would welcome all of your comments, questions, and feedback. So what I will do is I will speak for about 20 or 30 minutes on parent self-care. I will focus on the areas of self-care and well-being, the idea or notion of a trusted or a one good adult. I will speak about the importance of nourishment and depletion in relation to activities and self-care. I will also speak briefly about what we call the exhaustion funnel and planning for minding yourself or caring for yourself. Then Dr. Kadri and myself will open and welcome any questions and feedback, and we will have a bit of a chit chat for about 20 minutes or half an hour. So what I would just ask that you all please do is to ensure that your mics are muted and that you would please put any questions that you have or feedback into the chat box. So that was just to please ensure that the mics are muted. So Marshall, if you'd please go on to the next slide. Thank you. So when we think about self-care, or when we think about our role as parents, what comes to mind for you? So the words self-care and well-being. I just want you to take a moment to think about what those words mean for you. So just to think about that for a moment. And Marshall, if you'd go to the next slide, please. So for some of us, when we think of self-care and we think of well-being, maybe some of the words on this slide come to mind. So maybe some positive, helpful words around activity, minding ourselves, discipline, control, exercise, and so on. And that might be the case for you. And if so, that's wonderful. However, I'm also mindful that that might not be the case for you. So Marshall, if you'd go on to the next slide, please. For some of you, I'm also aware that self-care can bring with it negative connotations. So maybe words like stress, frustration, pressure, such upsetting negative words, maybe how you associate self-care and your life. What we know is that stress is not always a bad thing. Stress can be helpful in our lives. It can act as a motivating factor in our lives, and we actually need stress to a degree in our lives. However, we're also very aware that stress can be negative, it can be upsetting, and it can cause a lot of difficulties for us. So for you, I'd just like you to take a moment to think, if you associate self-care and well-being with words like stress and frustration, is it that your sense of self-care is actually a reaction and an attempt to avoid stress or upset in your life? Or is it that you actually actively engage in self-care for the reasons that we mentioned in the last slide, in order to mind yourself and to engage in helpful activities? It's just worth thinking about. So Marshall, if you'd go on to the next slide, please. Now, many of us, when we think of and we hear about self-care and well-being, these are words that are thrown about very readily in media and in society nowadays. And I think most of us are aware of the, I suppose, lifestyle choices that can be beneficial to us in relation to our self-care. So we know that by having a healthy nutrition, by staying hydrated, getting enough sleep, and so on, are fundamental in terms of our self-care and minding ourselves. But as I say, they're fundamental. They're basics. These are things that I would hope most of you are already aware of. So that is absolutely not what I will be speaking about or preaching about or anything like that today. But it is important to recognize that without these basic elements in our lifestyle, any other part of self-care is extremely difficult to engage in. So having appropriate lifestyle choices and engaging with those at a very basic level are absolutely fundamental in terms of minding ourselves. And the remaining things that I will speak about today are secondary to those. Without those fundamental factors, the other parts of self-care and well-being are extremely difficult to have and to obtain in our lives. So Marshall, if you'd go to the next slide, thank you. Now, most of you are here because you are parents to children who may be going through times of difficulty themselves, but certainly who are living in unprecedented times, times of change and times of difference. So for you as a parent and as an adult, I'm sure that you are here because you're invested in your children or your child, because you want to support them to the best of your ability. You want to be what we call a one good adult or a trusted adult. And what we mean by a one good adult or a trusted adult is that you are a helpful support and a very central part in your child or children's lives. That you are a confidant for your child or children, you are a helper, you are a support, you are a person in whom they can trust and rely and in whom they can have an open, honest relationship. However, in order to be that one good adult or that trusted adult, you absolutely have to be looking after yourself. You cannot be that confidant, that support, that trusted person for your child if you yourself are not in a place where you feel that you're able to look after yourself as well as possible. So I've put up this image of 5 batteries with the idea that when our own batteries are full or on green, that would suggest that we're at a place of balance in our lives. That not only are we able to get through difficult times and challenges such as now, but that we can do so with the support of others, and we can do so by supporting others as well, and that we engage in good self-care. However, what we know is that when we do not engage in appropriate or good self-care, our batteries or our energy levels deplete to the point where our batteries are empty, or in essence, where we reach burnout. We know from research that being a one good adult is something that young people seek. In November 2019, a survey of 20,000 young people and adolescents was released. It's known as the My World Survey 2. And in this survey of 20,000 young people, it was shown that 76% of these 20,000 young people reported having a special or a one good adult in their lives when they were in times of need. And those young people who reported having this high availability from a one good adult were found to be more likely to fall in the normal range for depression and anxiety. So that is to say that they were less likely than the other 24% to have or present with symptoms of depression or anxiety. They also were found to have higher levels of optimism, self-esteem, body esteem, problem-solving skills, social competence, and so on. What that shows us is that when we can be that one good adult for young people in our lives, it helps. It does support them, and it does show a positive impact or effect on them and on us. But we have to mind ourselves first in order to be able to be that person. So Marshall, if you'd go to the next slide, please. So in order to be that one good adult, what kinds of things do we engage in? Well, before we were ever speaking about coronavirus or COVID-19 and the pandemic, most of you, or all of you, as parents or adults, were engaging in not only this long list of activities and behaviors with your family, but a whole lot more as well. You were the listener. You were listening to your children, loving your children, fixing problems, organizing materials and the surroundings, cleaning. You were being so many things. And that was before we spoke of coronavirus. Now, you're expected to be all of these things and a whole lot more. For many of you, you're now also expected to be the teacher, the breadwinner, the worker, the friend, the confidant, and so many other things. And all of those things that you were expected to be now are before we ever even talk about school content that you are expected to engage in and support your children with. So the actual content of material that is being delivered to you in your workplace or your children in their school placements at the moment. And I found it interesting that we as a clinic have been updating our social media sites, and we've been providing families with lots of tips and advice and suggestions as to how to mind themselves and their children at this time. But what I noticed was that we, even in the supports that we are giving, have a tendency to use a lot of action words, and there are high expectations often for parents. So we put up something that I would very much stand over and still vouch for on one of our social media sites. And it was a tip sheet for parents around supporting their children's e-learning. Now, what I noticed on this tip sheet was that the following words were used in terms of tips for parents. And these words included encourage, take action, establish, ensure, maintain, monitor, implement, and so on. So again, these are tips, but almost expectations that some people may hold for themselves as parents. And it simply is not possible to implement, or to engage in all of these activities or behaviors at this time. Essentially, you cannot be all things to all people at all times. It is not possible. And certainly it is not possible now. So what is absolutely crucial is that you can learn to prioritize or limit how much you try to do for yourself and your family at this time. It is about prioritizing your own needs as well as the needs of your family. You cannot do everything. It simply is not possible. So Marshall, if you'd please, thank you. So when we talk about self-care or well-being, again, I wonder if many of us associate these terms with stress and negative connotations, or if we actually break it down to what it should be. Well-being or self-care should be about being or living well. It should not be a case of avoiding stress or managing it. It should be a lifestyle choice and a way, an attitude of living well. Self-care is anything that you do with the intention of being kind to yourself. It's not about being nice to yourself, treating yourself, or rewarding yourself. Self-care is not something that you earn or deserve. Self-care or well-being are parts of your life, and they should be that. They should be ingrained in you, in your attitude. It's not about waiting for free time to engage in self-care or well-being. You simply need to make the time. And again, self-care is not about or waiting for free time to engage in an act or a behavior. It should be a lifestyle choice. So when we look at self-care and well-being, we can look at it using this image. And this is a nice way I find of looking at self-care. So when we talk about self-care, I think many of us associate self-care with physical self-care. And it's what we often hear in the media. We hear about the importance of exercise, of eating well, of getting enough sleep, of going to the doctor when we need to do so. And absolutely, these are crucial. And certainly this is a core element of self-care. However, this is simply physical self-care. There are lots of other elements of self-care that some of us engage in, but I think many of us maybe let fall to the wayside. And these other elements are equally as important as physical self-care. And we simply must find and create the time to engage in these elements of self-care as well. So for example, social self-care. That's the idea of connectedness. And we know, of course, that following advice, we need to remain physically distant from others during the current pandemic. However, we can still be socially connected, such as through the virtual means that we're engaging in right now, or through phone calls. So if it is that you find that maybe you're not engaging with people as much as you were previously, that might be an area of self-care that might be worth considering for you to maybe implement or engage with a little bit more. Mental or psychological self-care. This, in essence, is the idea of the inner dialogue or chat that you have with yourself. So if you take a moment and think about how you engage with your own inner voice, are you your own worst critic? Do you berate yourself for not meeting work deadlines at the moment, for maybe not having enough work to engage with at the moment, for your children not finishing all of their schoolwork, or for your children being upset and fighting? Do you put yourself down for these reasons, or are you a support to yourself? Do you give yourself a psychological pat on the back and say, well done, you did your best today. You're trying to support yourself and your family. What is that inner voice in your head? And how are you responding to that inner voice? If it is that you are your own worst critic, perhaps this is a part of self-care that requires a bit more work. Emotional self-care. Again, this is something that I'm sure many of us are struggling with at the moment. With emotional self-care, that is essentially about learning how to control or regulate your emotions, to find calm at a time where you feel that your emotions are heightened. So again, for many of us, given the confined spaces in which we may be living and the compromised circumstances of our lives, we might find that we're becoming frustrated more easily, maybe a bit more irritable. Perhaps our mood is a bit more low than it usually would be. And if it is a case that you're finding this to be true, well then perhaps this requires more self-care, so that you can mind yourself, learn to calm yourself, give yourself space and time to get to a place of contentment in whatever way that might be. And again, we can discuss this in the Q&A. Finally then, spiritual self-care. Again, something that some of us may engage with and some maybe not. But spiritual self-care, in essence, is the idea of just being present, being grounded, being reflective or mindful. So for some of us, we find this self-care through religion, through meditation, through mindfulness, through prayer. For other people, it might be through reading a book, walking in nature, or simply just sitting and being with their thoughts. Again, if it is a case that you struggle to find time to just sit and be present, this again might be an area that requires a little bit more work for you. And this is absolutely critical and just as important as the other areas of self-care in order to enhance your own self-awareness and to understand your level of consciousness. So Marshall, if you wouldn't mind, please. Thank you. So when we look at self-care, and we've looked at it from 5 different domains, I wonder for you as individuals what your level of self-care is and what it could be. So I'd like you to take a few moments to ideally jot it down if you happen to have a paper and pen, or if you can write it into a phone, but if not, at least to have a think about this. So I'd like you to think about what your typical day currently involves. So maybe think about 10 or 15 activities you engage in. So maybe things like I get up at 7:30, I have breakfast at 8, I sit with the children for schoolwork, and so on. So I'd just like you to have a think about these for a few moments. While you're thinking about the different activities in your daily life, I'd like you to, while jotting them or thinking about them, write or make a mental note of which ones are nourishing and which ones are depleting. So when I say nourishing, what I mean is which activities support your self-care. What do you gain something from? Which ones are fulfilling? And I'd like you to write or jot or think about putting a letter N next to those activities. The ones that you find sap you of energy or bring you down or deplete you, I'd like you to put a D next to those ones. And again, take a few moments to do this. While you are doing it, I'm sure some of you will think or say, I'm not sure if this one is a nourishing one or a depleting one. And if that is true for you, that in itself is interesting. And I'll speak in a moment as to why I feel that is interesting. So just take a few moments and continue to complete that. So while you're doing that, if some of you find that you're unsure if something is nourishing or depleting, that's an interesting concept in itself. So maybe take a moment and think about why it is that you're not sure if it's one or the other. It might, for example, be that on any given day, work for you is a nourishing activity. It might be something that you find fulfilling and you gain from. On other days, work, that same work placement and the same colleagues, might be exactly what depletes you or saps you of energy. If that is the case, then that's interesting, and it might be worth thinking about at another point why it is that on some days it's nourishing and other days it's depleting. The likelihood, I imagine, is that there are other factors relating to that can be brought back to self-care and whether or not you've engaged in those activities. So, did you get enough sleep? If not, perhaps work on that day is depleting. Perhaps another day you've exercised in the morning, your energy levels are high, and work suddenly is nourishing. It's an interesting concept. So Marshall, if you just move on to the next slide, please. So as we think about these nourishing and depleting activities in our lives, we can think about them by looking at what we call the exhaustion funnel. Now, the exhaustion funnel is a concept that was derived or established by Dr. Mari Asberg from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. And she is an expert on burnout. And what she proposed was that when we think about these activities in our lives, we can think of them as a funnel. So at the top of the funnel, when things are going well, that tends to be a time when we have balance in our lives. So we have a mixture of both nourishing and depleting activities. We can engage in self-care and show resilience when we're faced with challenge. When, however, we find ourselves getting busier, we tend to prioritize certain activities over others. We tend to see certain activities as more important. And then the funnel becomes narrower and narrower. And generally, Dr. Asberg proposed that it's the nourishing activities that would tend to get dropped as we see ourselves getting busier. So the physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual self-care activities tend to be dropped. And we tend to see these suddenly as being optional in our lives. And then we tend to see the depleting activities, the stress-related activities, as being crucial, important, or paramount in our lives. And when this happens, we tend to lose energy, feel guilty, have aches and pains until we get to a point of burnout. So if it is the case that you find that your exhaustion funnel is becoming narrower and narrower, the likelihood is that for you, perhaps you have begun to drop those nourishing activities and prioritized and over-focused on depleting activities. So Marshall, if you go to the next slide, please. So in your own exhaustion funnel, can you think back to the activities you were just thinking about a few moments ago? And can you think of any of these named activities that tend to be first dropped when you're busy or stressed? Have a think about this and think about whether or not there is any pattern in what gets dropped first. Take a few moments to do this. I know certainly for me, when it is a case that my exhaustion funnel becomes narrower, certainly I find it's my nourishing activities that get dropped first. I see them as optional. I see the others as paramount or important. So Marshall, if you go to the next slide, please. So for you, if and when this is the case, do you know early on what your warning signs are that you are falling through this exhaustion funnel? If you know your warning signs, how early do you know them? I know for me, having reflected on this for quite some time, my warning signs of me hitting that exhaustion funnel are very, very simple. They are things like my number of times of exercising a week falling, that maybe I get a takeout more regularly than I would usually, that perhaps I don't clean my environment as regularly as I usually would, and my sleep pattern tends to change slightly. So for you, do you know your warning signs and do you know them early? If not, it's worth reflecting on and engaging with this process. When you do know your early warning signs, do you know what you can do to try and overcome these, to get back to the top of that exhaustion funnel? If you don't know, what I would strongly advise is that you start with looking at those nourishing activities that we spoke about, and that you enhance and begin to prioritize those as much as you prioritize the other activities. That you begin to realize that they're not and should not be optional, they should be paramount. So Marshall, if you'd go to the next slide, please. Now I've written this slide here, the very simple message, and it is that self-care really is most important when you feel you deserve it least. We spoke already about the idea of psychological self-care and being either your best support or your biggest critic to yourself. So if it is that you're not engaging in enough psychological self-care, if you berate yourself and put yourself down, if you tell yourself that you're not deserving of self-care or you don't have time for it because you have to prioritize other people or other things, well, that tells you straight away that your inner voice is being critical to yourself. So that in itself is telling you that psychologically you're absolutely not engaging in enough psychological self-care. So it is at those times that it is most important that you engage in the 5 different domains of self-care. As I've already mentioned, self-care is not earned or deserved. It's absolutely necessary to exist. It is not and should not be a treat. It should be an investment in your present, but certainly into your future, to mind yourself for now, but for later in life as well. It can be very difficult, and I'm really mindful of that, to engage in all 5 domains of self-care. Some people can do it very well and readily. For other people, it's a lot more of a task or a chore or a change. So perhaps for you, you can begin by focusing on one of the 5 domains we've spoken about, and even engaging in one activity that you find is nourishing for you. Ideally, you want to get to a point where you're engaging in all 5 domains of self-care on a daily basis. But start with one, and even if it's something as simple as prioritizing the need for you to seek professional support if you're berating yourself psychologically, or going to the doctor if you physically feel unwell. That might be as simply as it starts for you, but over time you would hope that you create and make enough time to really look after yourself. So Marshall, if you go to the next slide, please. And it really is crucial, this message. You have to nourish in order to flourish. We spoke about nourishing activities. As a parent, as an adult, if you want to be the one good adult or trusted adult that we spoke about, you really have to put yourself first and mind yourself first. So how can I meet the needs of my young people during this time? It is through self-care as a start point. We know from research that when young people are in need and when they're seeking support, when they're looking for a one good adult, they're not looking for somebody to take things out of their hands and take complete control of their lives. What they're generally looking for is a support, a listening ear, and somebody to guide them through these challenging times. So in saying that, what we should be thinking is not that we take on a lot of additional chores, problems, challenges for our children and ourselves, but simply that we mind ourselves and guide our children through challenging times. So Marshall, if you just go to the final slide, please. So again, to go back to what we spoke about, minding ourselves from all of these 5 domains are and need to be crucial for us to mind ourselves, and then in turn to mind the young people and children in our lives. We know that to care for another person is a generous act. To care for another person, you need heart. But in order to survive, you need boundaries. And that goes for your family too. You have so much to give to yourself and to other people, but you only have so much that you can give at any one time. You need to prioritize yourself in order to look after other people too. So can you take time from now on to deepen the love that you have with yourself and to mind yourself. It's just something to think about. Thank you. What we will do now is Dr. Kadri and myself will have a question and answer, a chit chat, and a chance for you to ask questions and for us to maybe chat about those. But what I would just ask is that in any questions or feedback that you have, that you please write them in the chat box rather than using your mic to speak or express them verbally, because there can tend to be quite a bit of feedback. So if you just write any feedback into the chat box, we will then go in that way through answering those questions. So thank you. Khaled, are you there now?
I am, just me.
Great. Super. Marshall, I'm wondering if you can take down that presentation so we can just put the visuals up, please. Thank you. Great. Now I'm not sure, Marshall, it's still on my one. Yeah, thanks. So Khaled, I don't seem to be able to, I can't see the, no, I can't see the chat feedback or questions yet, so I'm not sure if you have access to those. But Khaled, I suppose first of all, just based on what we have been talking about and thinking about for the last half an hour or so, I wonder if there's anything from your perspective that you want to either add to or elaborate on at all there, because I know I've been speaking quite a lot.
No, and thank you very much, Mary, for a lovely presentation. It's I've heard the presentation now twice, I think, and every time I hear it, I hear something new and helpful. I think as you were talking, the thing that came to mind when talking about prioritizing and almost putting things into routine, the thing that came to me, and we can appreciate that as parents, you tend to be, I loved your slide about trying to be everything for everyone all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's always a question of time. And it's, anyone who's in whether you're in full-time employment or as a parent, time is the most precious thing that you either have or you don't have. And certainly time management is a key bit of staying on top of things. And I think the issue of prioritizing what you need to do in order to stay well and be well and happy within yourself. And as you say, the thing that tends to go first when things get busy is time for ourselves. And I think a lot of the parents, certainly coming into the clinic, would just say that there's just not enough time, and people tend to think that you need big amounts or big commitments to be able to make time for yourself. And often it's about being mindful and in the moment, as you say. So even if it's, a lot of us will engage in lots of activities throughout the day, and it's being mindful whether we are cooking, whether are we cooking just to make food to sustain ourselves, or are we really enjoying that particular aspect, or it could be as simple as listening to or losing yourself to a nice song or a nice tune, or savoring a lovely moment of a sunset or nice weather. So I think it doesn't need to be because often people say they don't have the time to do these things, and what I'm advocating is all it takes is a few moments, and it's the accumulation of those brief little moments throughout the day that kind of balance all the other stresses and chaos that might happen of trying to be everything for everyone.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with that, because particularly at the moment when people, again, are taking on so many new roles within the family, I think even things, I guess, simple as from a social perspective and kind of minding ourselves and caring for ourselves and those around us socially, to again maybe try to make time to sit as a family and eat together, or if that is the norm for you, to do that, but to do it in a way that you're more aware of it, that it's an opportunity to have that social connection. And there are so many things that we could outline and discuss. I'm very aware of that, but I see here there is a comment or a question coming through, so I'll just read it out for those who are here. Oh, there were a few coming through. Let me just go back. So this person has said, how do I deal with sleep patterns in my family, as my elder son is coping with his schoolwork well, but my younger son is sleeping more during the day. He is unable to cope with the number of assignments posted by the school daily and gets aggressive or emotional if forced too much.
Yes, we've certainly seen some of that in the service here, and I think I think the key word has to be balance. So if you have an adolescent who is nearing their final years and heading off to uni, then for sure assignments and homework and staying on top of things is critical. I think what we sometimes see is children as young as 6, 7, and 8, and parents would come in and say, we're overwhelmed by the amount of work that is being asked. And certainly if you have children who are at different stages, as the person asking, you have a preschooler, someone in primary school, and possibly an adolescent. And how do you manage the difference in time zones, if you will? I think part of the advice I was going to give is that actually parents within their own households are experts in knowing what to do, and they will have the skills and the tools to be able to do that. I think the advice that we're giving is by means of summarizing and almost because sometimes there's a risk of information overload. So I think it's almost by means of a reminder that parents will have a strategy in place that whilst this person, whilst the toddler is asleep, you can, clear some time to do some work with the adolescents. When this person wakes up, then they take priority, and then the adolescent can go off and do their work. So I think it's prioritizing, again, managing your time in a way that fits in with your own family and with your own household. If you have one child is different than if you have 4. I suspect it's going to be much harder, but it's also reaching out and seeing what is available to you, whether it's a spouse or a parent or help at home, and utilizing all of the available resources and help that you have available to you, that it's not all, it doesn't come all back on you. Of course, the situation might be different if you're a single parent, for example. It makes the task more challenging. But I would have to say that it has to be a question of having an agreed plan and a timetable, and then, where possible, able to put that and establish some sense of routine and stability in the household, so that every day doesn't become a challenge and throw up the challenge every single day.
Yeah, and I think what you just said there is, and Khaled, very well, that I'm a huge advocate for the idea of scheduling and routines for young people in particular. And I think that that's, for me, what I would be really focusing on as well, is that if you find that your child is maybe sleeping more than usual, or that they're becoming more irritable, having that routine or schedule, and ideally having, for younger children in particular, a visual reminder of what that schedule involves or entails, can be helpful for lots of children, but being flexible with it. So, and again, as you well know, I often advocate for the idea of choice boards. So having a schedule, but within that, for your child, that they have some choice in the tasks. So for example, between 10 and 11 a.m. might be schoolwork, but they might have ownership of what task in school they'll engage with. So maybe it will be English, Arabic, or maths, and that they can choose themselves which they want to prioritize. It can just, for some children, help in order to sustain or enhance motivation a little bit. But I think, I'm mindful of lots of other questions that are coming in. But yeah, I would totally agree with what you're saying, Khaled. It really does come down to balance, and it's really difficult to find the time. But trying to just create some schedules can be helpful for some children. So hopefully that answers that question. Now the next question we have is, how can cope with the stress the kids are facing, especially that my kids are only expressing their stress by crying regarding small things and starting to get a bit aggressive? So I think they're asking, how can we cope with the stress at the moment when children are becoming emotional and upset?
And I think the answer to this one has to be depending on the age of the children. And with older children, it's a bit easier to try and explain things. With younger children who are expressing their frustration with emotional tantrums or behavioral difficulties, it might be a bit harder, not impossible, but just makes the task a bit harder. And I think the starting point has to be the recognition that actually times are a bit difficult. Some of the activities that you and I might have engaged in to be able to blow off some steam or feel better about ourselves are somewhat limited. I mean, we can try and change and have the flexibility to change the behaviors, but things like going on holiday or going out or meeting people are hard enough for adults, let alone for younger children who might not understand why they can't leave the house, or when they leave the house they have to be under certain circumstances. So that would be my starting point, is the recognition and almost the empathy of, we understand that things are difficult both for adults and for young people. Now, like I say, it then depends on the age and the almost intellectual ability of the children and how you deliver the message in a simple way. And the third bit, and you know that we're big advocates of this, is, I would say, positive parenting. So getting absorbing some of the frustration and the anxiety and the crying of the children being unhappy, and gearing them and steering them towards activities that they feel fulfilled and nourished in a sense of accomplishment, will have to be the way that you can divert children at that age, I suspect 4, 5, 6, in sort of, acknowledging, empathizing, understanding their frustration, and then gearing or channeling that energy into something that is a shared activity that is fun and engaging, where they can then feel a sense of fulfillment from, would have to be the way you approach this at this particular age.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think that essentially, as you've said, using child-centered language that's appropriate to the age to deliver a message in an honest and transparent way is crucial, so that we're not delivering mixed messages or untrue messages. I think I would agree as number one, that being crucial. And then the other thing, as you said, in terms of shifting their attention then to the environment in which they are, but using it to everybody's, I suppose, gain. So I know, as you know, some of us in the clinic, and you yourself, we're real advocates for the importance of play and using play in a positive way to support learning and to support overall development. So right now is a really good opportunity or time to do that. And as you said, to allow the children to maybe take the lead and to follow their lead in terms of the play in which you engage with your child. So yes, there are circumstances that are maybe confining us to certain spaces, but there's still always an opportunity to play with your child or allow your child to play and engage in that in order to support, I suppose, bonding, love, empathy, trust, but also so many different areas of learning, cognitively, behaviorally, developmentally, are associated with unstructured play. And again, I know, as you know, I could talk about play for hours, so I won't say any more, but yeah, I feel very strongly on that. I'm just seeing there are some more comments coming in. The next one is also, does school distance learning in special education needs children really help them? So I think they're saying for children who might have additional needs, is having the distant or remote learning, does it actually prove helpful for them at all?
Well, I'll give you my thoughts, and then as the ed cycle, I'll let you take the lead on that. So I've always been a big advocate that schools are actually offer so much more than just the education. So schools are about so much more than, social sciences and maths and English and so on. What you get from schools are how to communicate with others, how to be in a crowd, how to understand hierarchy, how to make friends and fall out with friends and make friends again. And so there's quite a bit, and I say this in for the listeners who don't know, in Arabic, in most of the Middle East, the term used for education, and I'll say this in Arabic and then I'll translate it, is التربية والتعليم, which actually means the تربية is upbringing and ta'aleem is education. So the function of the Ministry of Education and schools in general, it has an upbringing role and capacity to it that is almost prioritized before education. So I think being in schools gives you that opportunity. It gives you the opportunity to learn and, quite a bit beyond the actual education itself. Now, when it comes to children with special needs, I think it has to be a balance, because certainly some of the children who have, and we've certainly seen it in clinic, where some people who struggle in schools, who find school a difficult place to be because they struggle socially in those domains of being in groups and being around other children. Some of the parents have fed back that actually since the e-learning has started, their kids are so much happier, they're so much focused on their education, and they're just a bit more content in themselves. And they can then provide the social aspect of that through family and friends in controlled environments. So I'm certainly not advocating that children with special needs stay at home, but I'm saying it's a balance, and it's allowed. I think this recent experiment, or though it's been thrust upon us, has allowed parents to see what their children can be like in a school setting, but also in a home setting, with regards both the educational and the social aspect of things. And I think it has to be, on some level, a personal choice of what is in the best interest of the young person. So, I'm certainly, like I say, an advocate of the children being in schools, because they it's all about integration and understanding how to be around people, and with the right support and the right safety measures and safeguards, then that's an environment where young people with special needs will thrive. Equally, the other option is also, from the feedback we've heard from certain parents, an equally nourishing and thriving environment for children to be in.
Yeah, and I think, again, very great points that I fully agree with. I suppose one or two other little things that I would just say in relation to that specific query, and it's going to vary from one child to the next, but I think for children who might have additional or different needs, having the opportunity where there is capacity at home or in homes for somebody to maybe now be sitting with their child and supporting them individually, that can be hugely beneficial for young people. So if that young person has that additional support in school in a one-to-one setting, well then great. But if not, if they currently have it at home, absolutely the distance learning can be helpful for them and they can do well from it. And I think the one other point I would make is, in terms of children with additional or different needs, that for some of those young people, if they maybe have some intellectual functioning differences or difficulties, or if they are struggling cognitively, this is a really good opportunity from a functional level to develop those functional skills. So what we would call adaptive skills, how we live in a daily setting or how we live day to day. So engaging in life skills, in essence, if they're at home and there's capacity to support that, I think it's great. And the one last thing I would say about supporting children with additional needs in a distance manner would be the communication with school is absolutely crucial. That without that, it will be really difficult to support your child appropriately. That you need to be communicating with the class teacher or support teacher to ensure that they are aware as to whether or not the level at which they're delivering the work is the correct level. I know Dr. Ola and myself had a webinar yesterday on this exact topic, but what we call the just right level, which is the zone in which they'll do the most learning, is crucial. So having communication with school to ensure that that's correct is really important. I won't say more about it because I could speak for ages again.
Mary, coming back to your point about being everything to everyone, I think if we, for some parents, if they then feel they have to take on the task of being, the speech and language therapist or the occupational therapist and the behavioral therapist and the teacher and so on, can just be incredibly overwhelming. So again, it's a question of balance, and certainly we know from research that it's the continuity of care, and it's all a continuum. So whatever the young person who has special needs gets either from school or from any of the centers they attend, it's always helpful to then apply that in real life and at home, but with consideration, so again, it doesn't add an extra burden and load on the parents of having to take on all of these extra burden, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm mindful of the time, Khaled, and I know that we were a little bit late starting, but there are just a few more questions coming in that we'll answer briefly, if that's okay with you.
I'm happy with the time if the questions are coming in.
Right. So this person has said, sorry, one more question. How to avoid overeating for a 2-year-old, as I think she is stress eating?
Yes, I mean, I probably wouldn't worry too much about the emergence of an eating difficulty at the age of 2. I think I would almost say that at 2, it's well within, the job description of a parent to be able to manage the how much food. I can understand that sometimes children will get really cranky, for example, if they demand sweets or chocolates and so on. But I think it brings it back to, again, having a very clear, understanding, somewhat communication with, as much as possible with a 2-year-old of they're possibly only allowed a treat, I don't know, once a day or something. But we can certainly at 2, and I think it goes back to the words you were saying earlier about empowering parents to actually take control of that sort of feeding habits. And we know from behavior that initially there'll be resistance and there'll be tantrums and so on. If we hold the ground, if that parent can hold the ground, it's always a question of parents have to hold the ground, and by definition, the children will always try and push boundaries. But I think consistency is key. And if you hold the ground, then at some point we will see that behavior reduce. If it's inconsistent, the child learns, if I shout or scream loud enough, mom or dad eventually give in, then we're almost reinforcing the behavior in the young person that actually mom doesn't respond here, but if I really shout and escalate, she responds here. So that's where they take it straight away. So I would say be consistent, hold the line, and then set whatever measures that are acceptable within your family and your background, and the children, particularly at 2, will yield to that eventually.
Yeah, I agreed, and I'm laughing because I've had this exact conversation with so many parents recently, because I think particularly now when everybody is at home and tensions can be high and emotions can be high, that I think that inconsistency has maybe crept in a little bit for some parents who might otherwise be able to control or regulate their emotions well. So I think I could not agree more in terms of that consistent approach, definitely. Khaled, if you don't mind, there's just another question coming in here. It's what can we do for kids who are easily distracted, whether in distance learning or in fun activities? They're always hyper and their focus is everywhere.
I think for me that question is a question of threshold, and again depending on the age. So for example, if you have a child who's 3, 4, 5, we would expect that their attention span concentration would be 20 minutes, half an hour at most, if that. Certainly if the young person is, I don't know, in their teens, 13, 14, 15, then we would expect their attention span to increase. So the first answer has to be, it depends on the age of the child or the young person. The second bit is, it's a question of threshold. So all of us, I think it's important to have a distinction between what we would consider as traits and what we might then consider as something a bit more that goes into the area of we need to do something about. So, it might be that for younger kids, they're just built in a way that they're a bit more hyperactive and a bit more distractible and so on. The measuring stick of that is that really getting in the way of their day-to-day functioning? Is it really having an impact on their performance at school? Are they constantly losing things? Are they accident prone? Are they just really difficult to manage because they're running off everywhere? So the measure has to be, is the picture that we're seeing, is it getting in the way of this young person being well in themselves and having and causing disruption to the family as a whole? If it isn't, then it's traits that they eventually will, we can mold them out of. If it really is the case that they are hyperactive and impulsive and lacking having concentration difficulties, then it might be that at some level you think a formal assessment or seeing someone seeking professional help might be the answer to that. But for the time being, I would almost say that if it's not causing impairment, or if it's not getting in the way of day-to-day family life and functioning, then I wouldn't necessarily do much about beyond the positive parenting that we've mentioned. So, and also being very clear of expectations. So I would like you to sit here and finish this page of writing, or finish this page of reading, and so on. And we can be creative with it. So sometimes I've heard families say, they have a glass hour in front of the child, and when the sand finishes from this glass hour, then you can go up and do whatever they would want to do. So we would give these conditional, when you have done this, then you can go off and do the other thing, and just being consistent and positively rewarding the young person for the things that they're doing well, rather than sort of punishing or negatively reinforcing the things that they're not doing well.
Yep, thank you. And that person has just said it's a 5-year-old, and I think I would completely agree with everything you've said, Khaled, in terms of the positive reinforcement, use of rewards, and providing that feedback through rewards immediately. So if you see that the child has attempted something, that when you see that effort, you're reinforcing the feedback immediately by giving the sticker or the tick. I think, as well as that, the only other thing I was going to say is, again, trying to support them to create structure where you can. So if it's that you're expecting a 5-year-old to sit and engage in a school-based task, that might feel unnatural for a lot of 5-year-olds, just supporting them with that structure and giving plenty of breaks. Like, kids need to move, and especially young kids. But yeah, I think that seems to be the last question. That person, and actually lots of other people, have been thanking us and giving very positive feedback. So thank you all for that. I'm very mindful that we've gone 12 minutes over. So for some people, it's gone on longer than they had expected. So unless there is any other feedback, comments, or questions, I'll give people just one more minute in case there is, but otherwise we might finish it there. And Khaled, can I just thank you for joining me for this? It's very much appreciated. And all the people who have been present with us this afternoon, thank you all for the feedback and for the questions. It makes it far more interesting for us to have different questions coming in when we're having these discussions, because we talk to each other far too often about different topics. So having new things coming in is great. And just to let you know, we have been delivering a number of different webinars on a variety of topics of late. So if you would like to follow our website, which is maudsleyhealth.com, or follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn, and I think the handle is just at Maudsley Health. We're updating those regularly with information in relation to more webinars and just different updates in terms of what we're doing to support families and to support children and adults. And again, if there's anything that we have touched on today that you'd like more information about, or you have questions about, or you want to seek some more maybe feedback on, please feel free to contact us. Yeah, getting lots of positive feedback here, and I see one from, I think maybe a family member of mine even, so that's interesting. So Khaled, unless you have anything else you want to add, I'm all done.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to, if I sort of can leave a parting message, is that there is a lot of uncertainty going around, and I think there's so many webinars and so many talks about providing, tools for people to almost overcome the stress of what we're currently living through. Part of it, I think, is the acceptance that there will be uncertainty for some time. And it's being able to live with the fact that there is going to be uncertainty and be okay with it. And we can practice all of those things. But I think the first point has to come from an acceptance that actually things are a bit uncertain, and it's okay for things to be uncertain. Certainty in everything makes life very boring, I think. But also that in that, certainly with parents and children, that the children will learn through modeling. And, being a parent and modeling to the children of how is it to manage uncertainty, or how is it to manage stress. It's really important that, as the topic of the talk is being well in ourselves as parents, that children can see that actually, there is uncertainty, there is stress, but mom and dad deal with it by going for a run, or listening to music, or enjoying a bit of cooking, or socializing, or playing, and the children will learn that, and that's the way we safeguard them against some of the stress that's out there. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, great, thank you. And nothing more to add to that. I think you finished it perfectly. So thank you all very much for joining us and for the lovely feedback. It's much appreciated, and particularly thank you for being patient with us during the initial glitch. And hopefully we will see some of you again for more of our webinars or in the clinic at some point. And thanks, Khaled, as well, for joining me. Take care, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.